everybody and welcome back to the channel. Now, this is another better late than never review as I finally catch up to the X-Men 97 Marvel Legends wave from Hasbro. There are 6 figures in this wave and there are no Build-A-Figure pieces, so you're just getting the single carded figures. I'm only going to be looking at the 4 figures you see on screen today. That's Bishop, Gambit, Rogue and Magneto. I'm not going to be reviewing the Storm or the Wolverine because I already kind of have them in variants, and I'll explain that at the end of the video. Now I have to say I adore the packaging for this line of figures. We can see that Hasbro have brought back the plastic packaging, so we have the window display, which is fantastic. And I'm only going to look at one card today because they are all pretty much uniform. The only thing that changes is obviously the character that we see. And on that note, I'm really pleased that we actually have an illustration taken from the X-Men 97 animated series of that particular character. I think it looks really bright and colourful. I love the use of yellow, red, the blue, the black. I think this works really well. It's super eye-catching and it looks great on display. If you want to hang these on your wall or put them on your shelf, they're going to look really good and colourful and fun. Likewise, if we flip it and look at the back of the packaging, we have a photo of the figure itself up front and centre. We see the other characters that are available in the wave, and we have this really bright, colourful yellow background with the blue small print at the bottom there. I think this looks really good, so you can put this on display either way, and it's going to look really presentable. So let's take a look at the figures themselves, and starting off with Magneto. Initially, I had some reservations because I feel like I've had quite a lot of Magnetos from Marvel Legends lately, but this one actually is subtly different. Some of that is to do with sculpting, but a lot of it is to do with the paint apps, or the colours they've chose to use for this figure, because in the animated series going all the way back, and I guess they're carrying it over to the new 97 series, Magneto had red gloves. Well, sometimes he had purple gloves, but it kind of depended on how the cell had been painted, but generally speaking, he had red gloves. On the face of it, the body sculpt is pretty standard Marvel Legends stuff for a 6-inch action figure, but I do think the chest represents some new sculpting here. I think this is new. You may also notice that his cummerbund is sort of sculpted into place, which is quite nice, and in terms of the paint apps, obviously there's not a lot going on here. This is pretty much presented simply in the plastic that it is made in, but it is a very bright and colourful purple, a very bright and colourful red that they've opted for, and it's pleasing to see that his pants actually go over his thighs, and they've kept that colouring consistent. Now his cape is a hard plastic. Again, there's no paint apps on this, no weathering, no shading, nothing like that to give it a bit more depth and texture, which would have been appreciated, but it is nicely sculpted and it actually has a nice shape and silhouette to it. Now, I must confess, in my ignorance when this figure was first announced, I assumed they were simply just going to repackage an existing Magneto, and the last Magneto I have is from the Family Values 3-pack, which came with Quicksilver and Wanda, of course. But as you can see, these figures are actually a stark contrast to each other because almost every element is completely different, which is really pleasing to see and a bit of a surprise, to be honest. The most noticeable is the cape, of course, a very different shape, very different colouring. We can see on the comic book version of Magneto, we have a little bit of shading there, which I do appreciate. I also like that metallic effect they have on the top of the collar there. I think that's really cool. But overall, I have to say, actually, I prefer this shape of the cape on the X-Men 97. Plus, also, I prefer this shade of purple as well. This just is a lot more colourful for my palette. Again, we can see that they've used 2 entirely different body sculpts for the actual upper chest area. This new X-Men 97 looks a lot more toned. The muscle groups look a lot tighter. Not that the comics version has been any slouch when it comes to going to the gym, but it's obviously a very different sculpt, which is really cool. And you can really see the differences both in the helmet, but also in that cape as well. The one advantage the comic book version has over the X-Men 97 version is that it does have an extra point of articulation, a swivel at the top of the calf. And speaking of articulation, let's take a look at the X-Men 97. He does, of course, have a ball joint at the top of the neck, so the head can spin all the way around. It can just about lean left and right, but not a huge range of motion here. But he can look up and down a good distance, a surprising amount of distance actually given that helmet, so I'm really pleased with this. He's got ball joints in the shoulders that lift all the way up, which is great. There's a complementary bicep swivel there as well, a double joint in the elbow, and we have a pin swivel at the wrists. Of course, that hand rotates all the way around and it hinges forwards and backwards. Now there's a straight swivel at the waist so he can spin from side to side, and then he's got that ab crunch in the top of the chest there as well, so he can bend forwards and he can kind of go backwards a little bit as well, so pretty decent all in all. Now he's got more ball joints in the hips, the legs will kick out to the side, there's an upper thigh swivel there, and of course the legs will kick forwards, and they'll go backwards, and there's a double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to lift all the way back. And then we just have that ankle pivot there at the very bottom, where the foot can rotate from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. Sadly, he's pretty light when it comes to accessories. There's no special effects, there's nothing really except an additional pair of closed fists. And that's your lot. Got to be honest, that's fairly disappointing. I'm going to give this figure 4 stars because otherwise it's a really great figure and I can't think of any reason to criticise it. I'm really very happy with it. I think the joints are solid. We've got some decent articulation here. The sculpt's really nice. The paint apps where they are really well done as well. Now, would I have liked a bit more shading? Yes. In fact, I would have loved some cell shading, but that is not meant to be, clearly. But I think they've done a decent job here on this figure all in all. What prevents it being a 5-star figure really is just the lack of accessories. It just feels a bit mean because we've had at least the sort of magnetic effects that go over the wrist in the past. They would have been easy to throw in here. They throw it in with most other characters. Why not Magneto? So they could have done that. They could have gone one better though and given him an alternate head, an unhelmeted head. That would have been absolutely fantastic. Okay, so next up we have a fan favourite in Rogue. Now everyone loves her Jim Lee 90s costume and the comic book version of this figure has been very tricky to track down, so you kind of have a second chance here, but there are some very obvious differences, most notably in the colouring, and of course that head sculpt is animated series specific as well. Now, talking about the sculpt, I actually say I don't know if this is actually a really great likeness of the original series animation style. Obviously, this is much more reflective of what is coming in the new Disney X-Men 97 series, which I haven't seen yet, so I can't really vouch for it. I have to say, though, I really do like this sculpt. I think this is a really pretty version of Rogue. I think they've done a really nice job with the sculpt, and it's really nice looking. So I think they've kind of done a really good job, even if it isn't faithful to what I would necessarily want, which would have been something much more faithful to the original animated series. I think this is actually a really nice looking figure, and I'm really happy to have it in my collection. Now, we've seen most of the pieces on this figure reused elsewhere. This has been mostly cobbled together and recycled from existing figures. One of the key things that I want to point out, though, is the colouring on the jacket, because, of course, the comic book version of this character had a brown jacket here, and the animated series, it tends to be more of a green, and this has been reflected here. And I think, again, they've done a decent job. There's no real paint apps on this. We do have the X painted onto the arm there, which I think is really, really good. And you will notice that in the hands, we actually have this really cool sculpted hand, which is actually a fist holding the glove as if she's pulled it off the other hand. That is really, really cool. I think we've seen this before, so I don't think it's original to this figure, but it's a really nice piece to have. Articulation scheme is pretty similar to Magneto. She has that ball joint at the top of their head, and as you can see, the hairpiece actually isn't a massive hindrance, which is a real pleasant surprise. She can actually get a pretty decent range of motion out of this, which is great. She has the ball joint in the shoulders, so the arms will lift up and out. She has a pin swivel at the elbow, as a lot of the female characters do, so sadly no double joint here, but the lower forearm does spin all the way around, and it will hinge to about 90 degrees, but being as this is a rather delicate joint, as you can see, this takes a little bit of persuasion, shall we say, to get it to move, and I'm always slightly hesitant that something will snap here, but to be fair, it's actually worked fine. I think that first one is always the worst. Now, she does have a pin swivel at the wrist, of course, so again, that rotates all the way around, and it hinges forwards and backwards. She has a ball joint in the upper torso, so that means she can spin all the way around, and of course she can lean left and right as well. It also allows her to bend forwards and backwards, although it's not a huge amount. Now, the belt is a separate piece, and it does wobble a little bit, but really, from my memories of the animated series originally, this was slouched. It should have been a lot looser than it actually is, but maybe they've changed things for the new series. Now, there's ball joints in the hips, of course, legs will kick out. There's also an upper thigh swivel, so that upper leg will rotate all the way around, the legs will kick forwards and they'll go back, and of course there's a double joint at the knee allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back there. And then finally we have the ankle pivot, so of course the foot can hinge forwards and backwards and it can rock from side to side. Accessories wise, well, once again she's pretty light. She comes with an additional pair of hands, one gloved fist and one bare open hand. All in all, this is a little bit underwhelming, so I'm going to give her 4 stars, because again, I think this is a nice figure. I really do like this head sculpt, I've got to say, and I like the colouring on the figure. She's bright, she's colourful, I like the plastics they've used. I'm a little bit surprised by the belt. That might be specific, though, to the new series. I'm not entirely sure, so I'm not going to knock off a star for that. I do really like that she has the glove remove hand. I think that looks really, really quite cool. I haven't actually got that in my Marvel Legends collection so far, so for me, that's a real plus. But there is, again, something slightly underwhelming. I really wish they just added something a little bit extra. There's no Build-A-Figure piece here, so couldn't they have done something, some extra pieces, something interesting to make this figure more enticing? Next up we have Gambit, and again, much like the Rogue, we've had a lot of these pieces recycled from previous figures, but there's actually some nuances here and some new things which works pretty well. Most notably, his actual trench coat is brand new. Now, in terms of the head sculpt, this is also brand new. This is obviously brand new hair. I think they've done a really nice job with this figure. Now, I wish there was a wash running through the hair to just give it a little bit more depth or texture. I know they're going for the animated style, which is why we're not getting as much shading here, but even so, it would help out a lot. What I do really like about this figure is that they've actually bothered to paint in some stubble on the chin. That's new. I think that works really, really well. I like the expression on the face, and I think they've got the colouring pretty much spot on here. I do really like the central body sculpt on this figure, particularly the colour they've used to mould it in. I really love that pink. I think that works really well. It's really vibrant. It's also very glossy, and I think it just looks really, really cool. And it contrasts very nicely against the blue of the collar there and the black trousers as well. And the trench coat, despite not having any shading, is very nicely sculpted. It's much more tight fit into the body, and I really like the way this looks. Even from the back, we see those wrinkles there. This is really nice and thoughtful. I'm really glad that it's not smooth and they've actually thought this through a little bit. Now, the coat is a little bit of a hard plastic, which is unfortunate. It's particularly troublesome when it comes to the leg, but as you can see, the legs are nicely painted, and there's some decent articulation here as well, which we'll take a look at now. There's no real surprises here. He does of course have that same ball joint in the neck, which is great. He can spin his head all the way around, he can lean it left and right a pretty good distance, and of course he can nod it up and down a pretty huge distance as well. In fact, he's one of the best in this line for his head articulation. Brilliant stuff. Now he's got ball joints in the shoulders, of course they lift up and out, there's the complementary bicep swivel, and then he's got, sadly, a pin swivel at the elbow. I'm not hugely a fan of this joint on this figure, particularly because that hinge there is so chunky and ugly looking and it's so noticeable, which is a real shame, but overall I think it works. It makes sense. Of course he's got a pin swivel at the wrist as well. We've seen what that does. He's got another swivel at the waist, so again he can rotate all the way around, and he's got a hinge in the torso allowing him to bend forwards and backwards. Now he's got ball joints in the hips again, so of course those legs will kick out, but this is going to be very hard to do against that coat, so that's something to be mindful of. He's got the upper thigh swivel there as well. The legs will kick forwards, and they do kick backwards, but of course you're going to be stuck against this this trench coat, which isn't going to allow for you to do an awful lot, to be honest, because it's such a rigid, hard plastic. But you can bring the leg forwards and you can hinge at the knee there. You'll also notice there's another swivel at the top of the calf, which is really cool. And then he's got that ankle pivot at the very bottom there, allowing the foot to rock from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. Now, accessories wise, Gambit fares the best of all the figures in this wave. He comes with an additional hand with throwing cards effect, which is really cool. We've seen this before. He has also an individual throwing card. Again, we've already seen this. And he has his bow staff. Once again, nothing new here, but very nice accessories nonetheless. And there's actually a fair few different poses and different looks you can create with this figure based on the combination you use of these accessories. So I really like these. I think these work really well, particularly the translucent pink plastic coming off the card, the kinetic effect. I think it looks really, really cool. And, you know, obviously those throwing cards look quite dynamic, and that's why we're getting them again. And to be fair, if this is your first Gambit figure, then you're going to want all these pieces. So I think they've done a really nice job with this figure. Obviously, a lot of it is recycled. I'm going to give this figure 3 stars because it doesn't feel like there's an awful lot that's new here. What we have is really functional and works really well. In fact, it's probably one of my favourite Gambit figures to date from the Marvel Legends line, to be fair. I really love this new head sculpt. I really love the brighter colours that we're seeing. I like the new trench coat as well. I think that works really well. The accessories are fun and the articulation is decent, but it is very much hindered, and that's why it's got to lose a couple of stars, I think, for me. Because, of course, we're not getting any new accessories, but also that coat is really stopping it from getting the best posability that you're going to want. You can't really do an awful lot with it. You've got to work around it, which is quite frustrating at times. Finally for today we have Bishop, and I've got to be honest, this was the figure I was most anticipating picking up. I really like the look of this figure. I also really wanted an animated series Bishop, and I actually don't have an awful lot of Bishop figures in my collection, so I was really excited to get my hands on this. The first thing I've got to acknowledge though is the head sculpt. Of course, this is a very different look for Bishop than we saw in the original animated series in the 90s. Of course, this is specific to the upcoming X-Men 97 series, which has yet to air. I'm guessing, of course, they've changed his look, and that's absolutely fine. I'm sure this is probably going to be a very close likeness to what we see on screen. For me personally, I'm more invested in the original animated series. So at the moment this looks a little incongruous to me. It's not quite the look I want from Bishop, but maybe at some point we'll get an alternate version out there. Maybe we can swap out the head, because otherwise I think this is a really nice figure. I think they've done a really good job with the overall sculpting. This looks like a new sculpt to me, a new mold. I could be wrong, but I don't recognise this. I really like the bright colours they've used. I think this works tremendously well. Again, very much reminiscent of the animated series style, which is absolutely fantastic. No cell shading as I've commented on already, which is a shame, but nevertheless this is bright, colourful, and it looks the biz to me. I'm not going to cover his articulation here because it's pretty much identical to Magneto, but what I will cover is his accessories. He does come with an additional pair of gripping hands, and he has his shotgun. And of course, that shotgun does fit very neatly into his shoulder holster as well. Now, the only criticism I have of the gun is that it lacks any paint apps, which is a shame, but also it looks a little bit weedier than I remember. I remember this being quite a chunky thing that needed both hands to be held, so maybe they shrunk this down for the new series, but it looks a little bit off in terms of scale. Otherwise, I'm going to give this figure 4 stars. I think it's a really cool, bright, colourful figure. I think it's really nice. He feels a little bit oversized, quite chunky, really, as opposed to oversized, I suppose. He's a nice, chunky character, and I think he looks really, really good on display as well. All in all then, I really like this set of figures. I'm really happy with all 4 of these. I really like that, of course, they tie into the animated series. I like the colouring that they've used. I have some criticisms when it comes to the lack of accessories or the lack of imagination when it comes to those accessories. Maybe some of the scaling is off, but that will have to be determined when we see the actual new animated series when it airs later in this year. But right now, I think these are a nice group of figures. Now, for me personally, what I want is for these to marry up with my other existing animated series X-Men figures. The ones with the cell shading that I was a huge fan of, and sadly that line seems to have been discontinued now that we're getting these ones. So how do these figures mix and match? Well, the answer is pretty well. I've included here the Wolverine that was released as part of the original animated series line. Of course, you can see he's got the cell shading, but they literally reuse this figure, this sculpt, in this new line. And I have to say, the colouring doesn't look that much different. It doesn't look that off-putting. The cell shading doesn't even really register that much that it's distracting in any way. So I actually think you can combine these figures to have a full animated series set that looks fairly consistent, even if it looks slightly off when you get up close and personal. And that's ultimately why I haven't picked up the other 2 figures in this wave. That is Storm and Wolverine, because I kind of feel like I have these figures already. Now, the Storm is noticeably different. Her cape is obviously different to what we saw on the other animated series Storm figure that we've got, but the costume is more or less the same otherwise, apart from those wings. Of course, the big major difference with Storm here is her head sculpt, and she's obviously got the Mohican rather than the full hair. Now, again, for me personally, what I want is the animated series that I remember back in the 90s. That's the series that I want to kind of flesh out in my action figure collection. Yes, I've made compromises here with Bishop because I don't think I'm going to get him any other way, but for me, I already have the Storm that I want, and I don't feel there's anything really new being added by this new Storm. Now, of course, it is a different likeness, it has different wings, and it's going to be much more specific to the new animated series. So, of course, if you're into that and that works for you, then you're going to want this version. But for me personally, what I want is that nostalgic feeling, and I want to recreate what I had when I was a kid. As for the Wolverine, though, the Wolverine is virtually the same figure. Yes, we get some extra pieces. Basically, that unmasked Logan head, which I must admit is tempting. I would really like to have that, but I paid an awful lot of money for the initial animated series release with the cell shading, and this is the same figure, so I can't justify the double dip just for an alternate head. That's something I'll probably have to look out for on the secondary market, maybe. Or maybe if this figure becomes massively reduced in the future, I might pick it up then. But I'm not going to do it right now. But that's just me. Again, given that this is virtually the same figure, if you're not into cell shading, then this is probably the version for you. I think this is a really nice figure all in all, and of course it does have that extra head, which is a lot of fun. So it's entirely up to personal preference, but that's why I haven't picked them up, and that's why I'm not adding them to my collection, at least not yet. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.